Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Laken Riley Act.
Yeah, it's certainly been making headlines.
It has. It sparks so much debate, and not just about immigration, but also criminal justice.
You got it. It's bringing up some really tough questions.
So to really understand this, we've pulled together a pretty diverse set of sources.
Yeah, we're going from news segments to even some clips from YouTube.
Oh, and we even peeked into the congressional record for this one.
By the end of this, you're going to have a much clearer picture of what this act is all about, the arguments for and against it, and what it might mean for all of us.
Absolutely. So to kick things off, let's rewind a bit back to February 2024.
Right, the beginning of this story, really, the act is named for Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student from Athens, Georgia.
Tragically, she was murdered, and the person charged with her murder, Jose Antonio Ibarra, was an undocumented immigrant.
And that's where things get complicated, right?
hmm
Ibarra had some run-ins with the law before, but there were some gaps in the system, some missed opportunities.
Yeah, so our sources show that Ibarra had been arrested previously, but was released before ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, could issue a detention order.
And that's a detail that's been fueling a lot of the debate.
It's definitely added fuel to the fire, so let's break down the Laken Riley Act itself. What exactly does it propose?
It's got three main parts: mandatory detention, state power, and visa restrictions.
Okay, let's unpack those one by one, starting with mandatory detention. What does that mean exactly?
This provision requires DHS, that's the Department of Homeland Security, to detain any non-U.S. nationals who are charged with, arrested for, or convicted of theft-related crimes.
So when we say theft-related crimes, are we talking like serious offenses, or is this like shoplifting too?
That's where it gets interesting. The act includes even minor offenses like shoplifting.
So if someone's accused of stealing a candy bar, they could potentially be detained under this act.
That's how it's written.
Wow, that's a pretty broad scope. Okay, let's move on to the next one. State power. What's that all about?
Basically, it gives state attorneys general the power to sue the federal government if they think that immigration laws aren't being enforced properly.
So states could actually challenge the federal government on how it handles immigration.
Specifically, when it comes to detaining individuals covered under this act.
It's about giving states more control over how these laws play out in their own backyards.
Exactly.
All right, last but not least, visa restrictions. What's the deal with that?
The Laken Riley Act instructs Customs and Border Protection officers to consider anyone inadmissible to the U.S. if they've been arrested for or admitted to any theft-related crimes.
So even a past arrest, let's say for shoplifting, even if they weren't convicted, could prevent someone from getting a visa to come here.
Yeah, that's the intention. The act tries to block anyone with a history of these offenses, no matter how big or small, from entering the country.
Wow, these provisions, they're pretty far-reaching. I think before we jump into the arguments for and against the Laken Riley Act, it might be helpful to trace its journey so far. Has it been doing in Congress?
Well, it's been moving pretty fast. Republican Representative Mike Collins from Georgia, he introduced the act just recently on January 3rd, 2025.
So just a little over a week ago, and it's already made some serious progress.
Yep, it passed the House just 4 days later on January 7th.
That's incredible. And what was the vote on that?
It was 264 to 159, and what's interesting is it had bipartisan support. Even a Democrat from Georgia, Representative Lucy McBath, she voted yes on it.
Wow, that says a lot about how this case has really resonated. Okay, what about the Senate? What's the latest there?
Well, the Senate voted 84 to 9 to move the bill forward for debate.
Those are some pretty overwhelming numbers, so it sounds like the Laken Riley Act is well on its way to becoming law.
It's looking that way. The bill's currently waiting for the president's signature. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's get into the heart of the matter, the arguments for and against this controversial act.
Right, because it's definitely not a simple issue. So let's start with those who are in favor of the Laken Riley Act. What are their main points?
Their focus is primarily on public safety and holding the government accountable. They believe that detaining anyone who could be a threat, regardless of their immigration status, is the best way to keep communities safe.
Given what happened to Laken Riley, I can see why that argument's so powerful.
Absolutely. Her case is often used as an example of the tragic consequences of not detaining people who commit crimes, even if those crimes seem minor at first.
And this act, they argue, could prevent similar tragedies.
That's the idea.
Okay, and how does that accountability argument tie in?
Well, supporters see that provision, the one allowing states to sue the federal government, as a way to make sure the government is actually doing its job enforcing these immigration laws.
So it's about giving states more power to make sure federal immigration policies are actually prioritizing public safety.
You got it.
Okay, that helps clarify the arguments in favor. But of course, there's another side to this. Um, what are the main concerns raised by those who oppose the Laken Riley Act?
Opponents, and this includes groups like the ACLU. They have some big concerns about civil liberties and, the possibility of unintended consequences.
Okay, that's a pretty stark contrast to the arguments we just discussed. Can you expand on those concerns a bit?
One of their main arguments is that this mandatory detention, even for small offenses like shoplifting, it goes against the right to due process. The idea that everyone deserves a fair hearing.
They're saying that people, regardless of their immigration status, deserve a chance to prove their innocence before being locked up, potentially for a long time.
Exactly. And even a short detention can have huge consequences.
Absolutely. And opponents also bring up the issue of racial profiling. They argue that the Laken Riley Act could be used unfairly against immigrants and minorities. It's a serious concern. We've seen how these kinds of policies can end up targeting specific communities, even if that wasn't the intention.
Right. And then some Democrats, even those who are generally in favor of stronger immigration enforcement, they're worried about this act tipping the balance of power between states and the federal government.
So they're worried it could lead to a more chaotic system.
Yeah, they're afraid that giving states more control over immigration could lead to a patchwork of different policies across the country, making it much harder to manage immigration effectively at a national level.
So we've got these two sides, this clash of values, the need for public safety and accountability versus concerns about individual rights and potential overreach. It's complicated.
It really is, and I think it shows just how hard it is to create immigration policy that balances these competing priorities, especially in such a diverse society.
You've hit the nail on the head, so we've covered a lot of ground already. The tragic event that inspired this act, the key parts of the Laken Riley Act itself, and those core arguments for and against it. But now I think it's time to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture.
I agree. It's time to analyze the potential impact. What might happen if this act becomes law, both in the immediate sense,
Yeah.
with the immigration system, and then also the broader societal implications.
So how might this act ripple outwards? One question that pops into my mind is, what could this mean for the federal immigration detention system, which is already stretched pretty thin as it is?
That's a great question, and a crucial one. Remember, this act makes detention mandatory for anyone charged with, arrested for, or convicted of these theft-related crimes, even if they're minor.
So we could be looking at a significant increase in the number of people being detained, potentially overwhelming these facilities.
That's a real possibility. And that raises concerns about whether the system can handle it. Could we see longer wait times for hearings, more crowded detention centers, and even a shortage of resources to provide adequate care for detainees?
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. And are there concerns that this focus on detaining people for relatively minor offenses could pull resources away from addressing more serious threats?
That's definitely a trade-off that lawmakers need to think about carefully.
Okay, and beyond the impact on the immigration system itself, what about the broader societal ripple effects? Could the Laken Riley Act further divide people, make the immigration debate even more heated and politicized?
That's a valid concern. This act has already become a flashpoint with strong opinions on both sides, and it's possible that putting it into action could make those divisions even worse, making it harder to find common ground on immigration.
And could that lead to more gridlock, making it harder to govern effectively?
Exactly. When issues become so politically charged, it's hard to have productive conversations and find solutions that actually address the complexities.
Okay, so we've got this potential for unintended consequences, both within the immigration system and for society as a whole. Are there any potential positives, any unintended consequences that we should be aware of?
That's a good point. It's important to look at both sides. Some argue that this act could actually lead to a decrease in theft-related crimes, if the threat of detention acts as a deterrent.
So the act could potentially improve public safety, even if it's through a method that's, controversial.
That's a possibility that some supporters point to, but of course there's no guarantee of that outcome, and any potential benefits have to be weighed against those potential negative consequences we've been talking about.
Absolutely. This has been really eye-opening so far. We've learned about the Laken Riley Act, its potential impacts, and the really complex web of arguments surrounding it.
It's a fascinating example of how one tragic event can trigger these big legislative actions and these societal debates with far-reaching implications.
Before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a question, something to think about.
A question to ponder as we continue to explore this complex issue.
So, the Laken Riley Act focuses on detention for theft-related crimes, but it raises a much larger question. How do we balance the need for public safety with protecting individual rights, especially when it comes to immigration?
That's a question that goes way beyond this specific act. It gets to the heart of our values as a nation.
It's a question that deserves careful consideration, and it's a conversation we need to have, so we encourage you to keep exploring the Laken Riley Act and all the issues it raises.
Think about how it might be implemented, the legal challenges it could face, and what it tells us about the direction of U.S. immigration policy.
This deep dive has given you a good foundation, but there's always more to learn. Remember, this is a complex issue. There are no easy answers.
We encourage you to look at different perspectives, and engage in those thoughtful discussions and form your own informed opinions.
Join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the Laken Riley Act. We'll be exploring the potential challenges of putting it into practice, the legal battles it might spark, and what it reveals about the future of U.S. immigration policy.
Until then, keep those critical thinking caps on.
Welcome back. We're picking up our deep dive right where we left off, still exploring the Laken Riley Act.
Yeah, let's shift gears a little bit and think about what this would look like if it actually became law.
Right. I think it's helpful to imagine some real-world scenarios and see how it might play out.
Thinking about those practical examples can really make the potential consequences clearer.
For instance, let's say we have a young person, undocumented immigrant, and they're caught shoplifting, something small.
Under this mandatory detention part of the Laken Riley Act, that person, they'd be detained by DHS.
Even if it was a first offense, like a really small item.
That's right. The act doesn't differentiate based on, the severity or a prior criminal history.
It's hard to imagine a teenager, caught shoplifting, facing those kinds of consequences. It really highlights how this act could disrupt lives.
And it raises that question about the strain on the detention system. Detentions is expensive, and if this act leads to a big jump in detentions, well, could those facilities handle it?
Right. We'd need to think about the resources, the quality of care, all of that.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Imagine a state attorney general who's not happy with how the federal government's enforcing the Laken Riley Act.
Under this act, they have the power to sue the federal government, take them to court.
So states could challenge the feds on how they're handling immigration?
That's the idea. The act tries to empower states to hold the federal government accountable for enforcing these laws in a specific way.
But wouldn't that also lead to a lot of conflict between states and the federal government? I mean, wouldn't that just create more confusion?
It's a valid point. Opponents worry about a patchwork of enforcement, different things happening in different states, and that could make it much harder to have a consistent national approach to immigration.
It sounds like this provision could really become a battleground, in the already heated debate over immigration.
Yeah, legal experts and policymakers, they're going to be watching this closely.
Okay, it's clear that the Laken Riley Act, it has the potential to really change things when it comes to immigration enforcement, but we need to remember that this isn't happening in isolation.
Right. We need to look at it within the bigger context of U.S. immigration policy as a whole.
Exactly. So let's zoom out a little bit. Where does the Laken Riley Act fit into this larger landscape of immigration policy in the U.S.?
Well, it can be seen as part of this trend toward stricter immigration enforcement. That's been building for a while now.
Does this act reflect how the public feels about immigration? Has there been a shift?
It's hard to say for sure, but, public opinion polls do show that more and more Americans are worried about illegal immigration, and they want to see stricter enforcement.
And this act really taps into those concerns, doesn't it? Especially by focusing on that connection between immigration and crime.
Yeah, by its very nature, the act links those two issues, and that resonates with people who are concerned about their safety.
But we can't just make generalizations, can we? I mean, crime rates among immigrants are actually lower than those among native-born Americans.
You're right. That's an important point to remember.
So while the Laken Riley Act might seem like a response to these fears about crime, it doesn't necessarily line up with, the reality of the situation.
That's a core argument. For those who oppose it, they say it's more about fear and politics than evidence-based policy.
It's like this disconnect between perception and reality. It makes it so hard to have a balanced conversation about immigration.
Yeah, the debate often gets so emotionally charged, it's tough to find common ground and come up with solutions that address the real complexities.
Okay, let's bring it back to the Laken Riley Act. Given everything that's going on right now, politically, the direction of immigration policy, how likely is it that this act will be implemented exactly as written?
That's hard to say for certain, but the bipartisan support does suggest that it has a good chance.
And assuming it does become law, what are some of the big challenges that could come up during implementation?
Well, one of the biggest ones is making sure it's applied fairly, consistently, you know, across different states.
Because with states having that power to sue the federal government, could we see a lot of different interpretations of the act and a lot of legal battles?
It's a possibility. Opponents worry about inconsistency, and those legal challenges could really slow things down.
So even if the act becomes law, there's no guarantee that it will actually achieve what it sets out to do.
Right. The implementation phase is crucial. Will it be effective?
Yeah.
Will there be unintended consequences?
It sounds like the Laken Riley Act is just the beginning of a very long road.
I think that's fair to say. Even if it's passed, it's just the first step, and there are likely to be a lot of challenges, legal battles, and debates along the way.
And it's important for all of us to pay attention to how this unfolds, right? We need to
Yeah.
stay informed, see how the act's being put into practice, keep track of those legal challenges, and keep having those conversations about what it all means.
Absolutely. The Laken Riley Act is a big deal for immigration policy in this country, and we're only just starting to see how it might play out.
Okay, we've really dug deep into this act, but it's also raised a lot of questions about these bigger issues, that go beyond just this one piece of legislation.
Yeah, it's like a lens. It's helped us explore these broader themes about immigration, criminal justice, individual rights, even the balance of power between states and the federal government.
One thing's for sure, there are no simple solutions when it comes to immigration.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, and it demands careful consideration, thoughtful debate, a willingness to listen to different viewpoints.
Before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about.
I'm all ears.
We've talked a lot about how the Laken Riley Act might affect undocumented immigrants, but I keep thinking about the impact it could have on American citizens, too.
That's a really interesting point, one we haven't really focused on yet.
I'm wondering, could this act lead to more racial profiling if law enforcement is under pressure to enforce it really strictly?
That's a valid concern. There's definitely a risk that it could lead to more discrimination, especially if it's implemented in a way that relies on, stereotypes and assumptions instead of actual evidence.
And that could really erode trust, especially in communities with large immigrant populations.
Yeah, absolutely. The potential for this act to damage civil liberties and make our society less inclusive, that's something we need to acknowledge.
And I'm also thinking about the relationship between local communities and law enforcement. If this act leads to more detentions and deportations, could that create more division, more tension?
Yeah, that's a legitimate worry. We could see families torn apart, businesses struggling, just a general sense of unease.
And wouldn't that make it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs effectively, if they lose the trust of the communities they're supposed to be serving?
Trust is crucial. And policies that damage that trust, well, they can have lasting negative effects.
So while the Laken Riley Act is being presented as a way to protect Americans, we have to consider the possibility that it could also have negative unintended consequences for those same citizens.
You've raised some really important points. It's crucial to think about all the potential impacts, the good and the bad, when we're evaluating any law, especially one as big as this.
It's a good reminder that even laws with good intentions can have unforeseen consequences, and we need to try to anticipate those and mitigate them as much as possible.
And it highlights the need to really pay attention to how it's implemented and make sure it's achieving its goals without stepping on the rights of U.S. citizens.
The more we look at this act, the more complicated it gets.
It really does. It's a microcosm of all these bigger challenges we face when we talk about immigration, criminal justice, balancing security and individual rights.
And it reminds us that these issues are all connected. We need solutions that consider everyone in our society.
And that means having those tough conversations, even when we disagree.
Well said. This has been incredibly informative, but I think it's time for a break.
Yeah, let's take a minute to process all of this.
We've covered a lot, from how this act came about to its potential impact, the legal challenges it might face, and what it all means for our society.
We've looked at this from all sides, lawmakers, law enforcement, legal experts, and most importantly, the people and communities who will be directly affected by it all.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're in the final stretch now, and I think it's time to kind of zoom out, think about the bigger picture.
I agree. The Laken Riley Act is at the center of their discussion,
Yeah.
but we can't forget that it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Right. We've been talking about how it could affect public safety, immigration enforcement, but we've also uncovered some serious concerns about civil liberties, due process, all those potential unintended consequences.
And that brings up a really important question. Are there other ways to approach these issues? Other paths we could be exploring?
That's the question, isn't it? So let's broaden our perspective a bit. What are some alternative solutions that lawmakers could be considering?
Well, one approach that's getting some attention is something called tiered enforcement.
Tiered enforcement. What exactly does that mean?
Basically, it means focusing on removing those individuals who pose a real threat to public safety, but taking a more nuanced approach for those who haven't committed serious crimes, or who have strong ties to their communities.
So instead of this one size fits all approach to detention and deportation, we'd be looking at each case individually.
Exactly. It recognizes that not all undocumented immigrants are the same. They don't all pose the same level of risk. So it allows for more flexibility in deciding who should be prioritized for removal.
That sounds a lot more humane than the mandatory detention in the Laken Riley Act, which seems, pretty inflexible.
It definitely addresses some of those concerns about going too far, those unintended consequences we talked about.
Okay, tiered enforcement, that's one idea. What else is being discussed?
Another approach is expanding community-based alternatives to detention.
So what would that look like?
Well, instead of keeping people locked up while they're waiting for hearings or deportation proceedings, we could use, other methods to monitor them.
Like ankle bracelets, that kind of thing?
Yeah, ankle bracelets, regular check-ins, maybe even community service.
The idea is to make sure they comply with the immigration requirements, but without, locking them up and disrupting their lives.
Exactly. They can stay in their communities, keep their jobs, be with their families.
And I imagine those programs are much cheaper than detention.
Yeah, cost is a big factor. And many see community-based alternatives as more humane, less disruptive.
So we've got tiered enforcement, community-based alternatives. Any other innovative ideas out there?
One that's been gaining some traction is the idea of creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who, meet certain criteria.
So instead of just focusing on enforcement and removal, we'd be giving people a way to get their status sorted out legally.
That's it. It recognizes that many of these individuals are already contributing members of society. They have families, jobs, they've built lives here.
And wouldn't that encourage them to, come out of the shadows, pay taxes, participate more openly?
That's the hope.
So we've got these three alternatives. Tiered enforcement, community-based alternatives, pathways to citizenship. They seem like pretty good starting points for a more humane and comprehensive approach to immigration.
They offer a different perspective, that's for sure. The Laken Riley Act is all about detention and removal, but these alternatives are more nuanced. They try to take individual circumstances into account, prioritize public safety, and minimize disruption to communities.
It's clear that there's no easy answer, no magic solution when it comes to immigration.
It's complex, and it requires us to look at things from different angles, balance competing priorities, be willing to adapt as things change.
And it requires us to be willing to have those difficult conversations, even when we disagree.
The immigration debate is too important to be reduced to sound bites and political games. We have to approach it with seriousness, respect, recognize that real people are affected by these decisions.
This deep dive into the Laken Riley Act has been a real learning experience. I mean, we've gone from its origins to its potential impact, the legal battles it might face, and what it all says about our society.
We've really gone deep, haven't we? From the halls of Congress to the lives of everyday people, trying to understand the human stories behind all of this.
So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one final thought. The Laken Riley Act, it came about because of a terrible tragedy, but it's also given us this opportunity to really think about immigration, criminal justice, the kind of country we want to live in.
That's a conversation we need to have, and it's a conversation that we all have a role in shaping.
To stay informed, stay engaged, talk to each other, advocate for the policies that you believe in. Let's work together to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep striving for a better future.